to another video. So last video I said I wanted to do stuff outside of classical music. I was thinking about doing kind of venturing into jazz a little bit. So I figured, since I kind of had been thinking about that, and I guess in honor of Black History Month, I thought it'd be fun to do a little bit of a deep dive kind of into the background and origin of jazz music. Because it's not just, it's not just like classical music that has a really cool and deep, rich history. It's other genres of music too. When I had the idea of making a video about jazz history, I didn't want to just kind of do what everybody else does, which they kind of tend to start, early 20th century or so, and start with New Orleans and like all the major like prominent jazz musicians, and then kind of go from there. I wanted to talk about the things that not as many people kind of discuss or talk about when considering the history of jazz, or at least the stuff that's kind of glossed over really quickly. More like the kind of origins before it hit New Orleans, and then kind of stopping around that point when it does hit New Orleans and really starts to spread and get popular. Because I feel like that's where a lot of interesting information is. A lot of kind of the, I want to say like entomology, but I will have to look up to see if that's the right word. Editing Lexi, will you share with us what the right word is that I'm looking for? But I want to kind of look at the origins and the history and what influenced jazz and kind of how it came to be what we know it to be today. So let's start at the very beginning. What do we know about kind of the origins of jazz and the origins of the music that kind of came before jazz? Probably the reason why we don't really talk about the first origins of jazz and a lot of the early years of its predecessors is because we really don't know a lot about what went on during that time. This could probably be for a number of reasons, such as for the fact, it's folk music. A lot of folk music, and also the cultures that these musical genres come from. It's based on a very oral tradition, and so, when you pass things down from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, nothing's being written down. And so therefore, if any changes are made along the way, we have no record of that. We just know what's been passed down. We have no any kind of way to trace back to see how things have evolved. We just know how they are today. I think the other part of that, though, is also knowing where these genres came from. Obviously, we really know that many origins of jazz, blues, ragtime, African, Caribbean music is rooted in the history of slavery, unfortunately. And so with that, not a lot is going to be written down and recorded about these people's cultures and their backgrounds and what they did in the day-to-day lives, because, it was often overlooked by the society at large of its time, which is, really tragic, just in a number of ways. But it is still part of the history of these genres, and as sad as, the history of slavery is, it still played a really important part as to how these kind of genres developed, as we'll get to in just a second. That's not to say that obviously any of the bad parts of these histories are good, but more so to show that, you can get something truly beautiful out of something that was tragically horrible and awful. Just because an awful thing happened doesn't mean that nothing good came out of it. So with that, obviously, I think the tragedies of the history of these genres needs to be addressed. But while we're addressing the things that did happen that were bad, I think that we shouldn't also overlook and ignore the beautiful things that did also come out of it. So with that, all of that being said, what are the things that kind of were put into the melting pot? What were the kind of things that were put into the melting pot to help create jazz? Well, probably the three biggest things that most people already probably know would be blues, ragtime, and kind of Western African / Caribbean music. It's not the only things, but those are probably the three biggest overall and the three most distinct for sure. So what did they bring to the table? What are the histories and backgrounds of these genres, and how did they go about to influence jazz? How did these things kind of help create and bring up jazz music? Well, let's start with African and Caribbean music. These have the least direct connections to jazz itself. There's very obvious influences, but because these genres of music had a lot of influence on other genres of music, like blues and ragtime, it's really hard for us to draw a direct line of connection of this element of jazz comes from this direct tradition of West Africa, or this direct tradition of Caribbean music. We can't really do that. Again, part of it is because, rooted in slavery, a lot of that cultural information has been lost because of the history of the people, but also a lot of it has just been tossed around and mixed up and meshed together between small pockets of cultures of people. And the best we can often do is just to kind of point out and say, here are some similarities. For example, West African and Caribbean music have a strong emphasis on syncopation. We clearly see that in jazz music, right? I mean, that's like the quintessential point. Like, it's not jazz if you don't have some kind of syncopation, right? But the syncopation of these traditions is very different than, say, syncopation you might hear in European music. European music does have examples of syncopation, but it's not played out the same way. It's not as emphasized in the same way. It's very, very different. And with these West African and Caribbean traditions, it's like the whole entire song that you're listening to is completely and totally reliant on the syncopation and that strong beat that you feel, compared to like European music or just other culture music in general. Another thing that really comes from these cultures is the idea of improvisation. Again, a really, really key element of jazz, right? I mean, if you've ever played in a jazz band, you probably know that somebody's gonna get a solo somewhere and they're gonna have to improvise and they're gonna have to do their own thing. That idea is also really prevalent from these cultures. And then one last kind of small, subtle element that we will see is the use of a pentatonic scale. So if you listen to like kind of West African or Caribbean music, it may not be a strict use of a pentatonic scale like we might hear in music from other cultures of the world, but a lot of the music does kind of center, for the most part, around 5 notes. We can see that influence in, take for example, the blues scale. The blues scale that you'll play in any kind of jazz band, and it's kind of used as a basic tool for improvisation, has a total of 6 notes. So not quite 5, but it's got that extra little passing tone of the flat 5. So overall, you could argue that it's close enough to being a pentatonic scale. And sure, while you don't have to rely strictly on the notes of a blues scale when you're playing the blues or when you're playing jazz, a lot of blues and jazz does rely really heavily on the scale and will mostly center around the notes in the blues scale, even if they do use a few passing tones here or there. Okay, but what about blues and ragtime? Well, let's start with blues. So going back to the very beginning origins of blues, what is blues music and how did it go on to influence jazz? Well, unlike the music of West Africa and the Caribbean, which are musical traditions from other cultures, the blues did start in America. And a lot of it came from the enslaved people who were living in America. Not all of it, but a good majority of it. But what differentiates it from other genres that we know that also came from enslaved people, such as spirituals or gospels? Well, spirituals or gospels can be more uplifting, they can be more religious music, they can be more celebratory. Blues is strictly about blues. In other words, it's about the tragedies of your life. Blues can kind of be used as a work song to help you get through a really tough work day. Blues is always about some kind of topic or some kind of event that's going on in your life that's just bringing you down. Blues can be really used as a coping mechanism for your hardships in life, rather than just kind of sucking it up and dealing with it. It's kind of a form of You can almost think of it as like a form of self-therapy. Okay? You can kind of think of it as a form of self-therapy. Yes, I did it. For a lot of the people who view it as an important part of their culture. Blues sounds very sad. It uses a lot of the minor scale degrees that we hear in traditional classical Western music, such as the use of the flat third or the flat seventh in its scale. So it has a very bluesy, sad sound to it, kind of emphasizing that depressing nature of many of the topics of these songs. Blues is also a kind of form of self-expression. So you can already see where that kind of plays into what later on becomes jazz. Playing the music itself is kind of that idea of playing from your heart or playing from your soul or playing from something that's very near and dear to you. Not that classical music doesn't do that, but that key element is so quintessential to what jazz is and also what blues is. Other things that were a part of blues and the history of blues that really went on to influence jazz are things such as the structure. Ever heard of 12-bar blues? Obviously, that's what blues is based around. Now, there's different variations of the 12-bar blues, with the most common one being broken down into 3 distinct phrases. The first being the 1 chord for 4 measures, the second phrase being the 4 chord for 2 measures and the 1 chord for 2 measures, the third phrase being the 5th chord for 2 measures and then the 1 chord for 2 measures again. That's a really simplistic overview of the whole structure of 12-bar blues, but the thing to remember is that the 12-bar blues tends to be pretty repetitive. But even though it's a simplistic structure overall, the simplicity of it lends itself really well to improvisation, which is also a key element of the blues, just as it was with West African music. Now, in terms of what you would use to play the blues and how that kind of affects jazz, probably the most common elements that you think of are singing, because if you're going to talk about your hardships in life, the really only way you can do that is through singing. And then probably one of the most common instruments that's used is the banjo, which comes from West African traditions. It's not strictly a West African instrument, but it is influenced from a lot. Now, when you think banjo, you might think blues, but you probably also don't think just strictly blues either, right? You probably think of other things such as country music. And that's because blues, although it did have a lot of roots in the enslaved people's culture, it did also have a lot of roots in the folk music of Appalachia, which gets a lot of influence from folk music of basically the British Isles. So like basically Scotland, Ireland, English, maybe some Wales in there too. I'm not entirely sure on that part, but just that whole overall area. But essentially, the folk music of the British Isles area was brought over from people who immigrated into the US and then moved into the mountains of Appalachia. So if you look on a map, you probably are starting to figure out where these two cultures really meshed to form the blues. So the white settlers of the Highlands and other country regions of what we know as the UK today, came together and meshed their cultures with people who were slaves, or after the Civil War, people who were formerly enslaved and now were free black people. Geographically, you can really understand how these two work together. Appalachia tends to be, I mean, it is in the north, but it tends to be mostly heavily in that southeastern part of the United States, where a lot of the slave states were prior to the Civil War. But because the music of the enslaved and formerly enslaved black people was more similar to the folk music of the people of the British Isles than compared to, say, like classical music, it's pretty easy to understand how these two cultures played off of one another and how they mixed together. Obviously, we don't have an exact history of this people came over here, these people came over here, they met in this place, and that's how they mixed together. We just kind of know it as it sort of happened over time. And that's the best guess we really have for it. But before we go any further, let's move on from blues and jump over to the history of ragtime and what ragtime's background is. So from a complete purist perspective, ragtime music is music that has the same background and has the same kind of influence as what blues did, aka traditions of West Africa, traditions of the Caribbean, and probably also elements of blues, because the people who ended up playing ragtime probably grew up on a lot of that folk music from Appalachia and the blues music. But it's been taken over strictly to the piano. Yes, there are ragtime songs that have been written for things like bands, but generally speaking, from a purist perspective, ragtime is strictly meant for the piano. Mostly because the way the bass notes move around and the way that the melody is often structured, it's usually comes from a piano-based tradition. But what is ragtime music? So, no, ragtime isn't really jazz. Some people do get that mixed up and say, well, ragtime is jazz music. I mean, you can kind of say ragtime is jazz music, but it's kind of like saying Latin music is jazz music. Are you wrong? I wouldn't exactly say that you're right, though. Sometimes people think that ragtime music is also a form of dance music, that like, oh, it was people taking the music from their traditions and their cultures, like black people taking the traditions that they grew up with blues or like spirituals or things like that, and then just moving it onto the piano for like dance music, right? Well, no. Ragtime isn't really, generally speaking, dance music. What you're probably thinking of instead is what's known as the cakewalk. So, for example, a really famous classical piece is Gollywog's Cakewalk by Claude Debussy. In this piece, he kind of imitates that cakewalk dance sound that was used for the dance called the cakewalk. It is very similar to ragtime, but when you look at the two different genres, ragtime is kind of an evolution of the cakewalk in terms of it's much more complex in its melodies. Cakewalk is meant to be pretty simplistic for people to move around and dance to. Ragtime is more of that listening music. Sort of like if you know anything about jazz, the difference between generic jazz and like bebop. So unlike blues music, which is very much that kind of folksy music, ragtime was more mainstream, much more popular. Yeah, people knew about the blues, but that's more of a cultural background kind of thing. Ragtime was in the mainstream and was super popular with everyone around America. And the biggest reason for that was kind of what other genres were popular at the time and what ragtime kind of took advantage of. So roughly around the 1880s to 1890s is when we start to see ragtime emerge. And one of the other genres of music that was really, really popular at the time is the march or the two-step, such as like John Philip Sousa's band. And if you look at the structure of ragtime, the time signature that you will see the most often is very similar to a march. It's either in like a 2 feel or like a 6/8 feel, so kind of like a triple in a duple meter. And it has a very march-like feel to it. So of course, if you bring in a new genre that's new and interesting, but still sounds similar enough to an already super popular genre of music, of course people are going to start to latch onto it. And they really did. People liked the syncopation that ragtime provided. That syncopation from those traditions of West Africa, from the traditions of the Caribbean, from the traditions of blues, that ragtime really took from, but then put into that super popular march-like feeling, and then played it out on the piano. But ragtime's not gonna get popular just existing in general. How did it really get out into the public? How did this genre of music really capture people's attention? Well, part of it is the way it was able to spread. So you think about the time period that ragtime really came out, 1880s to 1890s. So slavery is legally done and over with, even though racism still existed. And a lot of the people who had been formerly enslaved were now still living in the South, but were trying to find a place to live. And the easiest place, oftentimes, if you don't have a good place to start, is a big city. And big city has a lot of people. So if you're a black musician living in a big southern city, and you know about ragtime music, you've heard ragtime music before, maybe because it's part of your cultural tradition, because it's similar to what you grew up on, an easy way for you to make money is to play in a saloon or play in a colossal. Any place that has a piano where they want some background music, you play what you know and you spread it to other people. Other people can hear you come in. They go, what's that music? It sounds really cool. I like how it sounds. People are coming in and out the door as you're playing all day, and you're getting more and more customers because there's just a lot of people in a city. And that's really how it started. It's mostly from Black people making a living as musicians in cities, playing on the piano to kind of earn a few bucks in the local saloon or local, other nondescript businesses that may need a piano player at some point. And it really just starts to spread. And of course people like it. I mean, people today still like the genre, right? I mean, if nobody liked it, we wouldn't know about it. But that's really how it started to spread. But where it really got big was at the 1893 Chicago's World Fair. That's the first kind of official debut of ragtime music. It had been a thing prior to that, but at that World's Fair, it was finally showcased professionally for the public to hear, and everybody loved it. So then, of course, everybody wanted to get their hands on this. Everybody wanted to find sheet music so they could play it for their friends, because this is still like the 1890s, so technology was coming out in terms of recording, but there was nothing super official quite yet. And although technology was starting to develop and was slowly getting into the hands of people, there wasn't enough at this time for us to arguably say that, like, oh, they got a recording of it or a record of it somehow. That would come a little bit later down the road. So with all of these elements together, how do we get jazz? Well, obviously, if you grew up on the traditions of blues, with that syncopated rhythm, with that emphasis on improvisation, with a big emphasis on playing orally rather than through sight reading, and you have another similar genre of music that's starting to gain popularity and is really starting to capture the attention of American audiences and beyond, then we can really start to see where America and the world in general was really primed to start accepting jazz music. So where did it start? Well, obviously everybody knows that jazz really truly started in New Orleans. Why New Orleans? Honestly, there's no real true reason, but it was probably the best prepared place to spread it. I mean, think about the people who were living in New Orleans in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. It's a southern city, so you have a lot of Black people who were formerly enslaved who are still trying to find a new home. You have a lot of white people from a lot of other kind of cultures coming into the big city and mixing in with everybody else. And New Orleans is also home to a lot of Creole people too. So you've got a mixture of that French tradition, but also a little bit of that Caribbean tradition, all being mixed in together and creating jazz. I mean, any genre of music tends to just come together from people playing off of one another. I may play this song over here, and you may be playing this song over here, and I'm really liking what you're hearing from you, and you're really liking what you're hearing from me, so maybe we collaborate, or maybe I take a few things that I like from you, and you take a few things that you like from me, and we mix together, and we mash together, and all of a sudden, it's a brand new thing now. But jazz didn't stay in New Orleans. How did it spread out to everybody else? How did we get out? And the answer to that is technology. Right time and right place. Jazz may not have gotten nearly as popular as it was, and it may not have preserved such important key elements to it if it had not been for the advent of new technology. The first of which being the railroad system. Although jazz was kind of the birthplace Although New Orleans was the birthplace of jazz, we don't always think of New Orleans being the only city that was known for its jazz music. For example, St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago are Midwestern cities that are often brought up. And the reason why jazz was able to spread so easily throughout the Midwest is because of the newly built railroad systems that took people from one city to the next. People are now able to travel across the country much more easily when they only had a horse and buggy at their disposal, and now can take a much faster and a much cheaper railroad from one city to the next. But probably one of the most important pieces of technology that really helped spread jazz was the invention of sound recordings and the popularity of records in the home. So now, instead of just going out, buying sheet music, bringing it into your home, and having somebody perform it with you in order to listen to any kind of music, you can now just buy a record player and buy a record and play music without having any musicians handy, without needing to figure out how to play it yourself. And you could hear how somebody else played it and hear them play it the same exact way over and over and over again. And what's really important about the use of records and later on radio is that people could listen to a recording and completely bypass the need for any sheet music. If you've played jazz or you know anybody who plays jazz, you'll know how important listening is in jazz in comparison to just reading the music. I myself play piano, and I've played classical piano and jazz piano. And let me tell you, they are not the same thing at all. Many people who are classically trained pianists and are only classically trained pianists have a really hard time switching over to jazz piano because a lot of it is just by ear. A lot of it is by feel. A lot of it is knowing the music theory and just kind of being able to listen, pick up on it, and go and play. Whereas a lot of jazz pianists don't have as difficult of a time switching over to classical stuff because, it's just reading right down the line. You just kind of follow a series of steps. There's nothing additional to add on to it. And I do genuinely think that if the invention of recording music hadn't come out at the same time that jazz was starting to become popular, we may have lost that oral tradition that is so quintessential to jazz music as we know it today. I mean, think about it. With ragtime music, ragtime came out a little bit before recording was able to get into every person's home. And so because of that, we often see a lot of ragtime music being based on reading music straightforward. It's kind of the classical pianist version of jazz, They're able to play ragtime because it's just reading the sheet music in front of you. And although ragtime did have roots in improvisation, it couldn't really get out to people through improvisation. It couldn't really get out to people through oral traditions because people didn't have record players, and the easiest way for them in the 1880s and 1890s to spread the music was through the purchasing of sheet music. But with the invention of records, and later on into like the 20s or so, the spread of radio, which is really where we see jazz boom, it was able to get into people's homes directly, and you could listen to it, and you didn't need to be able to read music to play. I mean, some instruments, sure, but for the most part, it's still a very oral tradition. And this is where we see it going forward. You got your big name jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton going from city to city and playing jazz and spreading jazz through all of America and later on into the rest of the world as we know it. And that's kind of where I wanted to stop today because that's where most of the people will pick up the pieces and move forward from there. But I hope that what I've shared with you today has really been able to fill in the gaps as to where jazz started from and answer any questions as to why does jazz have the traditions that it has that we know of. So, with that, let me know in the comments down below what you think about the history of jazz. Is there anything you'd like to share your thoughts on? Do you have additional points that you'd like to make and tell me about? Because I always like hearing additional points from people who also are very knowledgeable on the subject. I'm not going to claim that I know everything in every last little detail, and I love learning from other people just as much as I love sharing information with audiences like you. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time. Bye.